Another founder Wisdom Pod today with Emilė Radytė. She is co-founder and CEO at Samphire Neuroscience. We're going to talk about foundership, wearable neurotechnology, which is one of my favorite topic, neuroscience, and everything in between. So, Emilė, welcome to the pod. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your company?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. So my name is Emilė. I go by Em as well. Was born and raised in Lithuania, and then left to the US for my undergrad. I went to Harvard for my undergrad doing neuroscience and anthropology there. So was always fascinated by the brain, especially as I started delving deeper, but also really found it important to relate whatever is happening to the brain to the society around us and to making a meaningful impact. So I really love the anthropology angle to it as well, and trying to make innovation that matters to people's lives. Also during college, worked a lot as an emergency medic and led Harvard's emergency medical service, which was super fun. I got to see a lot of the issues firsthand and also realize how undeveloped mental health care is, and how oftentimes, even as a medic, you rock up and there's nothing you can do. That was really foundational to me wanting to go more into public health, global health, as well as delve deeper into neuroscience and kind of translate whatever newest advances we can make in neuroscience into something that can reach people's everyday lives. So then I went to the UK, so back to Europe, and did my master's and started my PhD in neuropsychiatry in Oxford. And a couple of years ago, I co-founded Samphire Neuroscience, which is a women's health neurotechnology company, the first one in the world. And we're dedicated to essentially taking technologies neurotechnologies that have been applied in different fields and developing and shaping them specifically for women's needs, trying to address essentially gaps in women's healthcare. So creating more alternatives for things like premenstrual syndrome treatment or PMS, menstrual pain treatment, looking to diversify into menopause, as well as postpartum depression and gestational depression. So really looking at gaps where women feel like they haven't been satisfied. And oftentimes it's because of the complexity of neurons, of hormones, and trying to fit that gap with neurotechnology and what we can do with it. So that's the short of it. And yeah, we're primarily based in London, have a small team now, and hoping to launch our first product in January 2024.
Fascinating. You seem like a super brain. So let me start with this. How did you get accepted to Harvard, and how did that change your life?
Yeah, great questions. I think the first one is definitely luck. And I think you always have to recognize a little bit of that. But really, I think when I was applying in Lithuania, it wasn't a big thing to apply to the US. And I always thought that, everyone who went to the US just paid an insane amount of money for the education. And so when I was in actually ninth grade, through a friend, I found out that there were huge scholarships in the US. So essentially, if you apply to one of the top universities, the top 10 universities, so the Ivy League plus a couple, essentially a lot of them had big scholarships. And that kind of opened my eyes because I was always a bit of a nerd. But I think just realizing that I could be in an environment that's very different from home was exciting to me at that point. And knowing that that was feasible with those scholarships, I kind of knew that the only way for me to study in the US in the first place was to try to get into one of those top universities. And I was also always the type of person to think that, like, if you never try, you'll never win. So I was like, what's the worst about applying? Like, I didn't know what the chances were. I knew they were low, but I didn't know how it would go. And then, yeah, I guess I just went for it and I got lucky. And, I was always interested in a lot of things and very academic and keen on it. So I think it was the right fit for me. And it really opened my eyes to what the cutting edge was. So I think to your second question of like what it changed about my life, neuroscience wasn't a field really in Lithuania when I left. And actually since then, me and a couple of people from Lithuania have created Integrative Neuroscience Association, which is a Lithuanian organization trying to unite neuroscientists from across the world to work for Lithuania's sake on like psychosocial interventions and stuff like that. But it wasn't really a field when I left. So I would have never become a neuroscientist had I not left to Harvard. And I think I never would have seen where the cutting edge frontier is and what you can do with that type of technology and transform everyday life. So I think it changed my outlook. It changed the way I view innovation fitting into the world. And yeah, it made me discover neuroscience. I'm forever grateful.
I rarely speak to, I won't repeat myself here, but super brains like you. It seems like you communicate like 10 on 10. I've seen on your LinkedIn, you've got 4 out of 4 at Harvard. Like, how is that even possible? The highest honor. How much is genes vs how much you modified your own brain to be that way?
I mean, brain modification, maybe a little. Honestly, I think it's a combination of I actually think that everything that I have ever done, I've been really lucky to be able to see the reason behind it. Like I was never, and people who worked with me, they know that I'm actually terrible at doing boring tasks because sometimes I'm okay at doing boring tasks if I really see the meaning of them. And if they need to get done, I'll get them done. But I think fundamentally it's just I have the mental construct and I have taught a lot of it myself where whenever I need to get something done, I'm like, why am I doing it in the first place? And sometimes it might be as simple as like cleaning up the kitchen and being like, oh, it will put me in a different mental state, and therefore the ROI will be X, and therefore you kind of make the whole assessment. So I think just being able to do that cognitive framing that puts everything into perspective has been really helpful. And so even like if you look at like having a perfect score at Harvard, it might seem from afar that it's like amazing and outstanding, and it is, but it was made up of a lot of different exams along the way, and for each exam there was a reason why I took that class, and there was a reason why I ended up doing well in it and working hard for it, and I just tried to make sure that that reason was front of mind. So I think always knowing the reason behind what you're doing really makes you excel at it, because then you're like, well, if I don't excel, then have I accomplished the purpose? And I think it makes it a bit easier, but everyone's different.
But who are your parents? Like, yeah, what do they do in life? And did they put any pressure on you? And were you always that way? So that was the third question, testing your brain here. And fourth, is it fair to say that you are on the edge of OCD?
Interesting. So my parents were both engineers, and then I think they were definitely both very brainy and educational, and they've always emphasized the value of education. Like I think from when I was young, that was definitely important. And they were raised in the Soviet Union. It was a very different work ethic. Like I think people just didn't have that many excuses. Not that people have them now, but I think just the emotional life was a very small part of a person's life in general. So I think I definitely had a little bit of that, but they've been always extremely supportive. So I've been lucky there. In terms of conditions, I don't think I have OCD, and I'm a neuropsychiatrist, so I go deep into that. I do think I'm definitely on the ADHD spectrum. Like I do think about a lot of things around the same time, and I do get distracted. But I think fundamentally, it is also what has made me more forward looking. So I think whenever you talk about cognitive conditions and neuropsychiatric conditions, I think it's important to remember that they are high performing conditions potentially, and you can always live with them as long as you learn how to manage them. So I definitely have managed ADHD symptoms that have served me really well. But yeah, that's how I think about it.
Just posted on my LinkedIn, I like reframing words. I don't view these things as conditions. I view them as like superpowers, ADHD for sure. So I think we kind of need to reframe or just find another word. Same for OCD. I mean, you're a neuroscientist, so you look at it from the textbook academic definition, which is, yeah, mostly a disadvantage. But OCD is like being hyper focused and being a little bit obsessed to finish out things. For example, when I lose at chess, I want to cover it up with two victories that could qualify on the edge. And I view this as an advantage. I'm competitive and I'm a bit obsessed. For ADHD, I can look at the bigger picture, go in many directions without losing too much energy. I kind of dig tunnels between each of these areas. First
Yeah.
question for you about your career, quote unquote. Yeah, you've been how do you say that, a paramedic, the emergency
Yeah.
folks, like
Emergency medic. Yeah.
that must have been quite intense. Why did you get into that, and what lessons did you learn from there? And if you can include some juicy stories along the way, that would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, for sure. I got into it, to be honest, out of naivete, I think, and probably trying to prove something. Like, one, I didn't know how intense that would be, and I was like, oh, that's kind of like being a doctor, but like without the hormones. But really, I didn't know what to expect. And the second part is, I thought that I would want to become a medical doctor. That was always my historical dream. But I thought I would be afraid of blood, and so that was something that I was convinced of doing. And I was like, maybe if I try. Well, and I went to a couple of classes of becoming a paramedic, and they're like, look, we can train you out of whatever fear you have. And take that with a grain of salt. But I was like, cool, challenge accepted. Like, let's see. And actually, yeah, I'm no longer sensitive to it. And it has definitely put something. it has also trained me very much. The one, it helped me go over some of my barriers, but also I think we spoke a little bit about the ADHD aspect. And I think to me, I was always bad at following very clear authority without having a reason. And being a medic is exactly following authority, following procedure, like sure, asking why something's happened, but really ticking boxes, making sure you're procedural, because if you fuck up and you're sued, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so I think I also wanted to teach myself some discipline. And know the reason why I needed to be disciplined and kind of show that to myself. So I think it was an excellent training for a young person who has a very active mind in different directions to learn to be focused on the spot, there to be stakes, because it's literally someone's life potentially at stake and quite often, and why you need to be procedural in those processes. So I think it was excellent training. In terms of things, so those are the main like personal things that I learned along the way. Some more like insights about society as well were like so I ended up leading the medical service at Harvard over time. And one interesting thing was that when we did like kind of our quality assessments, over 50% of our patients were psychiatric patients. And that was shocking to me, because when you think of medics, you're like, they rock up, they put band-aids and all that. But actually what turned out to be the case is like oftentimes you rock up and someone is suicidal or someone is in the middle of a psychotic episode and there's literally nothing you can do except for hope that you prevent it next time. And that's what actually got me down the line into like the mental health and the prevention aspect, and also the interest in kind of disadvantaged people and people who haven't been researched historically. So in my case, I went into women's health, but there's a lot of other disparities there as well. In terms of juicy stories, I think there have been a lot, but I think the ones that stick to me most were the ones where you rock up and you're just helpless. You're like, you have all of this training on how to do these like heart things, lung things, breathing, and you know, whatever's happening. But actually, most times you rock up and you're just providing mental support. And I think it's important to give a juicy story that's boring and to essentially tell you that most of the work of an emergency medic is extremely boring. You're on standby, waiting for something to go wrong, and hoping that you could do something on the spot. And imagine in 1 out of 2 cases, you're doing nothing, just your homework on shift, and then you get called in, and then you rock up and you're just sitting there with a very sad person for 4 hours, which could happen. And I think I think it's important not to frame some professions as always exciting, because then when people get into them and that's what the reality they see, they're like, oh, that's not what I signed up for, which wasn't what I signed up for. And it has pushed me into direction of like making sure that we see fewer of these people, because if we manage like mental health prevention, then the only patients we'll see are the ones randomly bleeding out or giving birth unexpectedly, as opposed to people in mental health crises. So yeah, I'm going to leave you with a boring story because that's what most life as a medic is, to be honest.
No, but I love those. Why? Because it's contrarian and it's like you're an independent thinker and you say things like it is, which is perfect to me and the listeners of this pod. But let me ask you this. You probably had tough situations. I mean, managing people in psychotic episodes requires lots of EQ and patience. How did you maintain your own sanity and how you maintain your shit together while there was a crisis at the other end?
That's a brilliant question. It was hard. I think for me personally, and I think it probably comes down to the fact that I am a pretty strong person with like a North Star, and that helps me kind of orient my own mental health as well. And because I do get very emotional on the spot, but I'm able to frame it a little bit outside of like all the causes that led to them feeling this way, and like, have I left the situation a bit better? Like I was lucky enough to manage most of those situations in my experience well. However, when I was leading the service, like obviously it was not just me. I was in charge of, 90 medics that at one point in the service, all of whom were dealing with, situations at the cutting edge every single day. And there we had some very difficult situations, people passing away. Also, I mean, the mental health crises are obviously can get very violent, and the medics need to protect themselves as well. But also, oftentimes there's a balance between, let's say, a violent patient and the medic wanting to provide support, but also exposing themselves to potential danger. And how do you navigate that as a leader of the company and trying to give advice to a medic who is very keen to provide support, but are potentially putting themselves in uncalculated danger? So a lot of this like risk assessment stuff going around, and we ended up actually implementing like a special mental task force, not because I think that task forces are extremely helpful, but we essentially created a source for people to talk to other medics, so essentially like a medic support group, to talk about what happened. And the other thing that we implemented very much was like after every single shift that was intense, we would have like a conversation as a team about what happened there, because we found that if you break it down into what actually went wrong while you're still in the adrenaline shock, it tends to help processing. And that comes from a lot of PTSD literature. And so essentially, if someone went on a very difficult shift, their shift supervisor would get a call of like, look, this just happened. And then usually we'd call in a couple of members of the executive and just whoever wanted to join in. And then we'd all come in and debrief right afterwards, which I think provided a lot of kind of on the spot, like one, the awareness that you're not alone because you get that support immediately, but also being able to talk it through before you're ready to talk it through. Actually, we found helpful because it hasn't yet settled into the like long-term memory of your brain. So it's still readily available short-term memory and you're making someone recall it on the spot. But then because you're talking to them, you can reframe it. And so essentially it ends up being stored not as a long-term traumatic episode memory, but instead as something like, you know, more like a fleeting element that happened because of all those reasons. So that was super interesting. And I think mental health in hospitals is a huge topic, especially after COVID, and the trauma that I saw there is insane.
Right. I have a question for that. I also love to do debriefs, yet it is hard to do when your brain is in fight or flight, even like an hour after the event. I find there's still a lot of cortisol in the brain. Hence, I'm not as brainy as I would be, and I don't make the debrief as...
But that's the point.
Yeah.
So that's the point. So essentially, there's a lot of PTSD literature saying that essentially, so if you think about the memory system of the brain, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but, you know, based on the practical knowledge that I have and the neuroscientific knowledge that I have, essentially the point is that normally your brain and the way that memory works is that you remember everything that's happening around you, but you need to bookmark to your brain what moments are important. And usually those bookmarks happen through emotions. So let's say you're really in love and then you remember that as a moment of love, or you're really scared, you remember that as a moment of being scared. And usually the way that PTSD happens or any strong memory gets essentially drilled into your brain is if there's like a big release of some hormone that signals a particular emotion. And for example, in PTSD, let's say there's a moment where so much adrenaline gets released, and then to your brain, it's like, there was an unusual surge in adrenaline. Therefore, this must have been an important moment. Therefore, let me remember every detail of it. But the problem is that if you let then time pass, sure, you'll be more brainy, more reflective, more whatever, mindful, etc. And then you'll be able to talk about it sophisticatedly and very nice, but it will already be stored in your brain. And if it is stored and if your brain reacts to it the wrong way, and there has to be a combination of other factors, you might develop very traumatic symptoms. However, if you have this huge surge in adrenaline and it's kind of starting to come down, and then you're asked to talk about it and to remember it, you actually can't really remember, as you say, like it just happened, you're still a bit shook. So you start to remember things and like try to put them around. And if you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, so did this happen? And you're like, I don't really know. And they're like, oh, maybe this happened because of X. You kind of reframe it in the spot and you don't let the adrenaline come down. So from the brain's perspective, it's like, oh, there was this big surge in adrenaline, but then there was also, it kept going. I don't even know what's important. I guess like whatever, let's let it go. Essentially, you separate the marker from the event and therefore don't let it store it as such a traumatic episode. Is the hypothesis there? And
so like
I've seen it work a
V1,
couple times.
a beta report, if you want, even though your brain is not fully cognitively there, you'd still do a beta, even if it's not perfect. In that case, you were like 2, 3, 4 humans. If you are solo, I guess you can grab a piece of paper, write down the events and talk to someone. Or if, let's say, it's a couple, well, they can talk together. What if the other person is still in panic mode and cannot help you do anything? I guess you grab someone else and talk with that same person. Would that be the model here?
Yeah, I think so. I think the whole point, at least from a theoretical perspective, is to make sure that it's not like you were calm, then there's a huge peak in the adrenaline surge, and then you went calm and then try to remember it.
Right.
Like the idea is to do anything that's like kind of active, like almost like, you know, just keep the hype up, whether that's through talking about the event or whether that's by going on a roller coaster, you know, anything to keep the adrenaline up, because the brain is silly sometimes in these ways, and that it doesn't care where the adrenaline came from. Yeah. Like you can fake it with other forms of adrenaline. Like let's say you just had a traumatic episode, you go on a roller coaster, you like go on a public speaking event, anything, it would probably not be able to tell. So yeah, I think it's an interesting model, and yeah, sure. I've seen it work.
You still have 15 minutes because my next pod cancel. Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's continue and scaling up interesting lessons. Thank you for sharing. Your first entrepreneurial experience, Integrative Neuroscience Association, I guess, and then you went on to found Samphire. Why did you decided to take that path and not go like a full-fledged, I don't know, professor in a lab or something along these lines? Is it because of the ADHD-ness? Like, why did you get into that?
So I think I might. So I love teaching, and I have been like a visiting lecturer in the university for some time now, and I've always taught, like even during college, have been doing a lot of tutoring and doing research. There's a couple of reasons. I think one, there's a right time and space for everything, and with Samphire, I know that I wouldn't be able to do the research. I am able to do the research and product development that I'm able to do through the company in an academic setting because women are still understudied and underfunded in academia. And through a business lens, I'm able to get it funding. I'm able to lead research studies. I'm able to build products and make a difference on people's lives. So I actually think that for this type of product, for this type of industry, at the moment, being an industry makes more sense than in academia. And, I've had examples of that in my life. And I think the other aspect is I think industry and like kind of business and entrepreneurship should be linked much more closely to academia. And in my academic experience, it has always been tightly connected because to me, there's a lot of different values of academia, but what I have found most meaningful is the ability to go from theory, like what I just told you about PTSD, to something that actually makes a meaningful difference into people's lives, which is actual interventions that you can do on the spot that you just broke down into some amazing tips. So I think to me with Samphire as well is like, if we can't start from the theoretical research and doing basic research and then building solutions, then let's build solutions with the people in mind from a commercial perspective, and then trace back all the little bits and pieces as well through the research. So I see them as deeply interconnected. And that's the thing that makes sense for me, definitely partially because of my ADHD, but also because I think that for areas like women's health, which has historically been seen as an impact area, which it absolutely is, it's an impact area, but it's also a freaking business. And I think that's important because if people start seeing money in these things, then it's going to flow into research as well. And I think historically, women's health hasn't been served well and ignored because it was seen as something you do as a nice to have, as opposed to a business opportunity. And so I think that's important to change because I think that will lead to a lot more positions for people like the future me as well, of like being professors in like women's health neuroscience, which isn't currently really a topic. Like there's maybe like 3 women's health neuroscientists globally, and a lot of them focus on pregnancy. So yeah, that's my
I have
approach.
a question. I want to bring you back in time. Sorry if I didn't ask it, but it really got my curiosity. You were chief of the EMS org of Harvard, so you served a population of 20K students. What did you often see there? I would guess like injuries from parties and like alcohol related things. Tell us a bit more about that, and tell us about the mental health on campus at Harvard. How did it look like? Was it toxic competition and so forth? What did you see while you were chief there?
Yeah, I mean, we categorize patients into 2 buckets, which were our most popular patients, and obviously none of them fit into that. Not all of them fit into that. So one of the parts was actually, as you described, so like alcohol, we call them kind of disorders of consciousness. And the reason why is that like, yeah, it sounds like alcohol poisoning and stuff, but like really on the spot, the decision that you have to make is imagine being a college student yourself and seeing your classmates. And there's obviously also that element of confidentiality. So you can never show to other friends that you've interacted with someone as a patient and you interact with them in classes, etc. But it was making the judgment of when someone is too drunk, that is from a medical standpoint and perspective, and giving clinical and medical advice. And I think it's super fascinating about the mind because obviously just the amount of alcohol someone drinks tends to, correlate with how drunk they are, but that's not necessarily the case. And the effects of alcohol can be different. Like if someone becomes aggressive, when they're drunk, you want to stop them earlier than someone who falls asleep. So I think there was a lot of like that interesting conversation. And I'm not trying to make being drunk intellectually stimulating. I'm just saying that those were very active problems that we as medics dealt with because you don't want to tell your friend from another class and be like, the annoying person who told them to go home. So it's always a balance. And then on the other side, we actually saw a lot of trauma. We supervised a lot of games. So like sports games, like everything from American football to soccer, which is what they call soccer. I'm European, so I'm still learning all that. And then, yeah, like all the other sports. So that would be everything from head injury, insane bleedings, Yeah, orthopedics, so broken limbs and stuff like that, headaches, concussions, everything of those sorts. So I would say trauma and the alcohol-related conditions were big. And then on the mental health side, which was the other like kind of half of the whole equation, no, I would actually put some of the alcohol, depending on the case, also on the mental health side, because oftentimes, so a lot of people, not a lot, like I don't want this to be framed that people in Harvard are depressed. People everywhere are depressed, and I think that's important. But if you drink alcohol with some antidepressants, it can have very bad effects and make you drunk much quicker. And so, for example, a lot of cases that first present as like, oh, they drank too much alcohol, half a glass of wine, but actually because they were on antidepressant, it might have affected them differently, or because they were on some other medication. So like also a lot of what we saw were drug-drug interactions, between medicines or between, recreational drugs and things like that. So I think on the mental health side, we saw a lot of different interactions. We saw psychoses, which were more, let's say, rare. Occasionally, suicidality, rape. Those were the more severe ones. There were a lot of vanilla ones, like people being upset, uncontrollably crying. Like honestly, it was the whole gamut. Like you're making me think on the spot, and there's a lot there. But I think what's always important is that regardless of the severity, regardless of anything, you have to always approach it with compassion. And pretty much universally, there's nothing you can do. Just document the hell out of it was, the mantra.
All right, thank you for that. Now, Samphire looks like rocket science kind of to build that, but must not, it's like brainwaves and so forth. I bought like 2 of these EEG devices back in the days. I'm not sure if you remember, but it's like a metal line and they track your brain waves. And I always had storms when I would meditate. I would be perfectly calm, and then I would hear the rain and the storm. And so I gave both of these, and I'm not sure why I rebought afterward. But anyway, this is fascinating what you're building right now. It looks really comfortable. So tell us the why behind that business. It's only $250 also, like it's not super expensive. And why focus on
it's only $250 if you sign up now. But yeah, it's it's a cool one. It's so essentially unlike EEG. So EEG is primarily recording brain waves, and we stimulate brain waves. So it's an actual approved treatment, or going to be approved by Q1 2024. And essentially, we stimulate 2 brain regions, one responsible for controlling emotions. So essentially, it controls the frontal cortex, which is the top-down control over your emotions. So in the PMS, so the premenstrual period, and I'm sure that a lot of women and men listening to this is like, I thought PMS was kind of a joke. But actually, if you look at the brains of women in the week leading up to their period, it actually looks more like people with depression than when they're healthy. So like actually women's brains do change before their period, so much so that some of them will have disproportionately low mood swings, like, irritability, all of those classic symptoms. And one of the main reasons for that is because essentially there's an imbalance in the frontal cortex, so it's no longer able to modulate the way you feel. So if you're feeling sad, you're feeling extremely sad. If you're feeling happy, you're feeling extremely happy. And you can see how that would lead to a mood swing and stuff. So we stimulate that area of the brain to essentially bring it back into balance, non-invasively, with over kind of 20 minutes of use. And then the back band essentially targets pain perception. So we limit pain perception in advance of your period. And so when your period comes, your brain ignores essentially pain signals coming from your kind of ovarian wall, uterine wall when it sheds. So that's kind of the logic behind it. A lot of our innovation is around making it focus on women, making it comfortable. So I love the fact that you mentioned it. Like we have done so much freaking R&D with all the women coming in and being like, oh, don't study me because I have an insanely big head. Turns out women do have big heads. Like, I don't know who told women that they have small heads, but like every single woman has apologized to us that she has a big head. So we developed it also to be something that most men wouldn't bat an eye at, or you could wear at work if you chose to. So it was very important for us to fit it around an accessory that was already natural. Because probably like the EEG headbands you mentioned, like oftentimes they just like look weird. Like people will ask questions and they will be like, you're definitely an early adopter type. Whereas what we wanted to create is a product that could be adopted at mass market, because we do hope for it to be reimbursable. At the moment, there are no reimbursable solutions for women with severe symptoms of PMS, and there are some options for menstrual pain. So we think that by creating a solution, we're validating the problem and letting women kind of own that solution space as well. So you wear it for 20 minutes a day for the 5 days leading up to your period. We're going to be primarily D2C, so you can buy it directly. But down the line, our intention is to go through doctors and go through the reimbursability system. But obviously, we just need to raise awareness.
Huh. I have it white, not black. Just one quick comment. And what if the woman has like a lot of hair? Like that's my second product question. The third question, what kind of tests have you done on the device to prove that it was effective?
Yeah. So on the first one, we actually made women of our community decide both on the design beyond like functional characteristics and the color. And the matte black was their favorite pick for the first design, but we will have kind of like the equivalent of iPhone covers to make them essentially customizable to your outfit. In terms of big hair, that's a great question. It's actually very much at the cutting edge of like, you know, where we're trying to go to is making sure that you can stimulate through hair in the first place. So in our case, we've tested a lot with like bigger hair, especially afro. So coily hair tends to be the more complicated one. And it actually is, as you point out, not very effective for extremely tight and curly hair, coily hair. If it is a little bit less tight, you can actually move it around and it works pretty well. And this leads into the third question. Actually, a lot of our user testing has been done in Brazil, which is an extremely diverse racially population, which means we got the opportunity to test it on a wide diversity of hair. And yeah, we noticed that for pretty much 95% of people, it does work very well, but there are particular hairstyles, so like braids, and then very tightly coiled hair where you actually cannot get to the scalp that will not work with a V1, but it will work in V2 because we do have a patent on a novel type of electrode that could work there. And yeah, I guess also leading into what our testing has been. So this technology that we're using has been used officially and is already reimbursable for the treatment of depression for the last 20 years. If some of the listeners might know about it, but those who don't, like you primarily know about it if you've had a family member or yourself have gone through depression treatment. And usually it's a second line treatment. So if let's say antidepressants haven't worked, but again, psychiatrists are still keen to keep prescribing different antidepressants. And depending on how far you are in the journey, you might have tried brain stimulation or not. So it's a very common depression treatment. And it's increasingly seen as like a chronic pain treatment as well. So we're still on that first wave of it as like a pain and other mood disorders type of treatment. And so we use a lot of that evidence for kind of our clinical evidence. And then for our own clinical trials, we have published a clinical trial in the world's leading brain stimulation conference last year. And we have still 3 ongoing clinical trials on like making it more effective. So we have our own proprietary kind of designs and also stimulation protocols. And then we also tested with volunteer women in the UK, essentially letting them consent and just use it at their own will. And so those are a lot of people who you'll see appearing on our website and kind of sharing their experience, who got the chance to test it out early. And even though, so we say that we address the symptoms of PMS and menstrual pain, some of them might fall under the diagnosis of premenstrual dysphoric disorder or dysmenorrhea or endometriosis, which are all clinical conditions. But we know that these conditions are severely underdiagnosed. So we let anyone who feels like they have these conditions use it. And then we always encourage them to get proper kind of diagnosis so they can also search for other alternatives as well.
Love it. Fascinating one. Where can people find out more about UM and where can people find out more about the company?
Yeah, so the best place to find us is at samphireneuro.com, as well as our LinkedIn and Instagram are some of our most active channels. I think Instagram is a great one, and we're going to be putting up a lot more educational content. We're also adding a lot more resources on our website. So if you're someone who struggles with it, we'll have like, you know, where to go to find out the diagnostics, where to find out more about the science. Also, so little is known about women's neuroscience. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of science coming out over the last year. We've seen a boom in this area. But it's still such early days. So also, you know, if you're a founder considering going into women's health or neuro for women, I'm always very keen to chat.